He was the smallest man on the Grand Ole Opry stage, but his legacy loomed larger than most. Little Jimmy Dickens, standing just under 5 feet tall with rhinestone suits and a booming stage presence, became a beloved face of country music for over 7 decades. To fans, he was the comic relief with heart, the man who always brought a smile. But behind the jokes and glitter was a story filled with shadows. In his final years, Jimmy became increasingly withdrawn, and strange choices surrounding his career, finances, and health began to raise eyebrows. Long after his passing in 2015, whispers never stopped. Was there more to his death than the public was told? Why did close friends begin asking questions? And what secrets were buried with him? Now, for the first time, new evidence has emerged. From altered contracts to missing money and erased messages, the mystery of what really happened to little Jimmy Dickens is finally solved. And what's been uncovered isn't good. Long before he became a rhinestone-studded icon, little Jimmy Dickens was just James Cecil Dickens, a poor boy raised in the coal country of West Virginia. Born in 1920, he grew up in a small, overcrowded home without electricity, where the radio was their only window to the world. That voice he heard coming through the speaker, Jimmie Rodgers, the original singing brakeman, lit a spark in Jimmy. By the time he was in high school, Dickens was performing on local radio stations, traveling from town to town, guitar in hand, often sleeping in his car or wherever he could. But even then, he had something special. A stage presence, a fire, and a willingness to poke fun at himself that made people love him almost instantly. In the late 1940s, thanks to the encouragement of 𝗿𝗏 and others in the Nashville circuit, Jimmy joined the Grand Ole Opry. It was a turning point that would define his legacy. But his small size made him a novelty in the eyes of some promoters, and for years, he was cast as the comedic sidekick rather than the serious artist he longed to be. That didn't stop him. With songs like Take an Old Cold Tater and Wait, and May the Bird of Paradise Fly Up Your Nose, he turned the joke around on everyone else, laughing with the crowd instead of for them. What people didn't see, though, was the quiet pain behind his eyes, the insecurity of being underestimated, the long nights alone after shows, wondering if the applause would still come when the joke got old. But the joke never did. Jimmy made himself indispensable to the country music world, touring endlessly, appearing on television, mentoring younger artists. He became a fixture even as others faded away. Yet with that rise came a new cast of characters behind the scenes. Managers, accountants, promoters, not all of whom had Jimmy's best interest at heart. In fact, some were quietly manipulating him, steering his money, controlling his bookings, and ensuring he was always just busy enough to never question where his earnings were going. As Jimmy aged, his ability to track the fine details began to slip. And that's when the mystery really began. By the time he reached his 80s, it seemed his control over his own affairs was largely gone. Someone else was pulling the strings. And as we dig deeper into those final years, the names and decisions that emerge begin to paint a picture far darker than the one fans ever imagined. By the time little Jimmy Dickens reached his 80s, he was a legend, still grinning on the Grand Ole Opry stage, still cracking jokes with the likes of Brad Paisley, and still belting out country tunes in his unmistakable high-pitched voice. Fans saw a spry, joyful entertainer who defied age. But behind closed doors, things were starting to change. His health had begun to decline, subtly at first. Missed rehearsals, quiet confusion about schedules, a noticeable frailty in his performances. Some brushed it off as old age. But others closer to him began to notice something deeper. Jimmy wasn't just slowing down, he was being sidelined. What's troubling is that this period also marked a dramatic shift in how his estate and finances were handled. According to insiders, key members of his management team, some of whom had been with him for decades, had started taking on more responsibilities, not always with Jimmy's clear consent. Legal documents were quietly updated, access to bank accounts shifted, and decisions about his properties, memorabilia, and even performance royalties were being made without his full understanding. One particularly disturbing detail emerged after his passing in 2015. Several of Jimmy's longtime assets, including a historic home in Brentwood and an extensive collection of stage-worn costumes, had been sold or transferred under dubious circumstances just months before his death. While the official paperwork appeared in order, some questioned whether the 94-year-old Jimmy Dickens had the cognitive clarity to truly authorize such decisions. And then there was the will. In a twist that shocked some family members, updated versions of Jimmy's final wishes surfaced, versions that heavily favored certain individuals who had gained influence over him late in life. Longtime friends and even a few relatives were cut out entirely. Whispers turned into quiet investigations. Questions about elder financial abuse were raised but never pursued formally. Many close to Jimmy claimed that he simply didn't want to make waves, that he trusted people around him, even as his mental faculties declined. Others believe he was manipulated, his legacy quietly carved up before he was even gone. But perhaps most heartbreaking is this: the very community Jimmy helped build, where he once walked with giants like Hank Williams and Minnie Pearl, became the backdrop for the slow erosion of his autonomy. And as more details surface, the mystery of how such a beloved star's final years became so murky is starting to unravel. As little Jimmy Dickens's health continued to deteriorate, so did the clarity surrounding the circumstances of his care. In the final 2 years of his life, Jimmy's public appearances grew sparse. When he did take the stage, often at special Grand Ole Opry events, fans noticed he was being physically supported more often, with longer pauses between his signature jokes and slower movement altogether. On the surface, it seemed natural for a man in his 90s, but insiders at the Opry whispered that something wasn't sitting right. Behind the scenes, those whispers grew louder. Jimmy, once fiercely independent, had become almost entirely dependent on a small circle of handlers. These weren't just caregivers, they were advisors, managers, and so-called friends who had taken over everything from his medical decisions to his bank access. The control they exerted was subtle but complete. Close friends and even a few remaining family members reported being blocked from seeing him. Calls went unanswered. Visits were rescheduled indefinitely. One source who worked backstage at the Opry claims that Jimmy would occasionally become confused during rehearsals and ask, "Where's Mona?" referring to his beloved wife of decades. But Mona had passed away in 1988. It was a chilling sign of how deeply dementia may have set in, and a red flag that his mental state may have been far worse than the public realized. And if that was the case, who was really making decisions for Jimmy during that time? Perhaps most alarming was a quiet legal transfer that happened just months before his death. A trust reportedly designed to manage Jimmy's estate had been amended, again, granting significant control to individuals who had only recently entered his inner circle. These weren't lifelong friends or Opry family. They were outsiders with legal leverage and financial interest. Here the mystery takes a darker turn. Around this time, 2 of Jimmy's longtime friends attempted to intervene. They contacted authorities with concerns of elder financial abuse and undue influence. But with Dickens still technically competent on paper, no formal action was taken. One of those friends later revealed that Jimmy once muttered, "They're taking everything, but I'm too tired to fight." Was he aware of what was happening? Was he coerced into silence? Or had his mind already been too far gone, manipulated by those who saw opportunity in the twilight of a legend's life? These unsettling developments paint a very different picture of Jimmy Dickens's final years, not as a peaceful wind-down of a storied career, but as a quiet takeover of a vulnerable icon. And the evidence continues to build piece by piece, revealing a slow, calculated unraveling of a man who gave everything to country music. What remains now is to determine exactly who orchestrated it and why. While the public mourned the loss of little Jimmy Dickens with tributes and musical farewells, behind closed doors, his estate was quickly becoming a battlefield. The man known for his rhinestone suits and oversized personality had left behind a legacy worth more than most fans realized. Not just financially, but culturally, and vultures were circling. In the months following his death, questions began swirling around the distribution of his assets. For a man who had spent over 60 years as a regular at the Grand Ole Opry, made countless television appearances, and toured extensively, there was confusion over how surprisingly little was left behind in liquid wealth. Jimmy had lived modestly, yes, but where had the rest gone? Suspicious financial activity was unearthed as court filings showed that certain properties Jimmy had once owned, specifically a family home outside of Nashville and several pieces of memorabilia expected to fetch high value, had been sold or transferred just before his passing. These transfers were done quietly, without major press, and often to LLCs tied to individuals involved in his end-of-life care. One insider close to the Opry community revealed that Jimmy's prized guitar collection had vanished shortly after his death. These weren't just any guitars, they were vintage, many autographed by legends like Hank Williams Sr., George Jones, and Merle Haggard. Several were never logged in any official inventory and are still missing to this day. Even more damning was a set of leaked emails between one of Jimmy's former financial advisors and a third-party collector. In them, there was discussion of moving items before probate and concerns over a potential lawsuit by Dickens's extended family. These emails suggest that people close to Jimmy may have been preparing to liquidate assets before they could be legally challenged. Meanwhile, a niece of Jimmy's, one of the few remaining blood relatives, attempted to contest the will. She argued that her uncle's declining mental state made him vulnerable to undue influence and that changes made to his estate plan in the final months of his life did not reflect the man she knew. Her petition included affidavits from old friends, former bandmates, and even a retired nurse who claimed Jimmy was barely aware of what was happening in his final days. The court, however, dismissed her challenge due to lack of medical documentation. By then, much of the estate had already been divided or sold. This wasn't just a case of mishandled paperwork. It was starting to look like a systematic dismantling of a man's legacy while he was still breathing, one that left fans heartbroken, friends outraged, and a family grasping for answers. The deeper investigators dig, the clearer it becomes. Someone or several people benefited immensely from Jimmy's weakened state, and the truth about who orchestrated it is just beginning to surface. By the 6th month after little Jimmy Dickens's passing, something strange began happening. People started to talk. Not just fans or family, but insiders from within the country music scene. Quiet whispers in the backstage corridors of the Grand Ole Opry turned into murmured suspicions. Something about Jimmy's final months just didn't sit right. And soon, a string of testimony and anonymous tips started to piece together a troubling portrait of manipulation, control, and exploitation. It all began with an Opry stagehand who had worked with Jimmy for decades. He claimed that in the year leading up to Jimmy's death, access to the aging performer had become extremely limited. Close friends were often turned away from visiting him, even when they'd driven hours just to say hello. Instead, Jimmy was kept under the constant watch of a newly appointed personal assistant, someone few had ever seen before, a man who claimed to be managing Jimmy's schedule, care, and finances. The assistant was allegedly brought on by a third-party management company hired to oversee Jimmy's daily affairs. But here's the problem. Nobody knew who vetted that company. According to former colleagues, Jimmy had always managed his affairs with a small circle of trusted people. Now, in his final months, that circle had been dismantled and replaced by strangers. One longtime Opry photographer recounted a chilling moment. He said he caught Jimmy backstage, sitting alone in a wheelchair, staring blankly into space. Nothing like the quick-witted, energetic performer he remembered. When the photographer went to speak to him, the assistant intervened, stating Jimmy was not up for visitors and physically turned him away. It wasn't the only instance. Others began sharing similar encounters, each eerily similar. Jimmy wasn't just declining in health, he was being isolated. At the same time, documentation shows that a flurry of legal changes were made: power of attorney, will amendments, and changes to property ownership, all signed during this suspicious period of seclusion. These documents transferred significant control to the very assistant who'd been shielding Jimmy from those who cared about him most. It was all done legally, at least on the surface. But the circumstances raised massive red flags. When local investigative journalists started digging, they were met with resistance. Phone calls went unanswered. Records were conveniently incomplete, and key figures involved either refused to speak or had already moved out of state. The management company in question dissolved just weeks after Jimmy's funeral, leaving no paper trail, no board of directors, and no accountability. But a pattern was becoming clear. In his most vulnerable state, little Jimmy Dickens was surrounded not by friends and family, but by gatekeepers, people who ensured he had no voice, no access, and no choice. And what followed was a rapid transfer of wealth, assets, and influence right under the nose of country music's most iconic institution. The deeper we go, the more it becomes obvious. Someone went to great lengths to silence Jimmy in life and profit from him in death. The only question now is, how far did they go to cover their tracks? As whispers around little Jimmy Dickens's final days grew louder, a new name surfaced. One that hadn't been mentioned in earlier reports but now seemed central to the entire unraveling mystery. A former business partner turned silent executive of Jimmy's estate. On paper, he was listed as a longtime friend, but those who knew Jimmy best said he hadn't even been in contact with this person for over a decade. Yet somehow he reemerged months before Jimmy's death, assuming control over large portions of his assets, contracts, and legacy rights. The red flags didn't stop there. Financial records obtained through a quiet investigation by a Nashville probate clerk revealed a sharp uptick in consulting fees being drained from Jimmy's estate after his death. Tens of thousands of dollars were redirected to various shell companies, all linked to this former associate. Even more unsettling, these withdrawals began mere days after Jimmy passed, suggesting that the planning had started well before he died. Meanwhile, Jimmy's widow, Mona Dickens, who was once very vocal about protecting her husband's legacy, had gone nearly silent in public. Insiders claimed she was under intense pressure not to speak to media or lawyers and had even begun receiving veiled threats warning her against digging into things that didn't concern her. Close family friends said she looked nervous, scared, and exhausted. A shell of the woman who had once stood beside Jimmy on every major Opry occasion. To further cloud the situation, Jimmy's Opry memorabilia and personal belongings began mysteriously disappearing. Guitars, handwritten lyrics, signed fan gifts, and even original Grand Ole Opry costumes started appearing in private auctions and collector groups across the country. Items that were supposed to be held in trust for the public were quietly sold off, often through intermediaries who refused to disclose how they came into possession of the goods. It wasn't just the tangible things being erased. Legal ownership of Jimmy's music catalog began shifting as well. Some of his lesser-known but still valuable recordings were quietly transferred to publishing companies that hadn't worked with Jimmy in decades. Royalties that should have gone to Mona or his estate were being redirected to unknown LLCs with vague addresses in Delaware and Wyoming, classic hallmarks of hidden asset laundering. The final nail came when a former attorney for Jimmy, now retired, spoke off the record. He admitted that in the years prior to his death, Jimmy had expressed deep concern about people circling him like vultures, trying to exploit his fame. The attorney said Jimmy feared being forgotten or manipulated, but was too kind, too trusting, and too tired to fight back. As more puzzle pieces came into view, the truth grew darker. It wasn't just a matter of mismanagement or confusion. This looked calculated, predatory, designed to strip little Jimmy Dickens of everything he built while silencing those who loved him. And the closer we get to uncovering exactly who profited, the more dangerous the truth becomes. In the aftermath of Jimmy's passing, as fans mourned and tributes poured in, there was one event that stirred quiet unease among those closest to him. A private memorial service that took place behind closed doors, away from public view, without cameras, press, or even longtime Opry colleagues. Many found this odd. Little Jimmy Dickens was a country legend, a symbol of the Grand Ole Opry itself. So why was the final goodbye so secretive? Why were invites limited? And why were so many familiar faces left off the guest list? The official explanation was that the family wanted privacy, but insiders revealed a different story. According to two former Opry stagehands who worked with Jimmy for over 30 years, there was concern about conflicting paperwork surrounding his will. In fact, multiple versions of the document had been circulated with last-minute changes that redirected control of his estate away from his family and toward that same questionable business partner who had reemerged shortly before Jimmy's death. One particular clause stood out. In an updated will allegedly signed only weeks before his passing, while Jimmy was reportedly on heavy medication, his music catalog, likeness rights, and even portions of his royalties were reassigned to a private entertainment trust based out of Nevada. That trust, according to records uncovered by an investigative journalist, was controlled by 3 individuals: all tied to former record label executives with shady pasts. Even more concerning, a safety deposit box that Jimmy had reportedly maintained for decades, containing everything from personal letters to original recordings, was emptied just days after his death. Bank logs show the box was accessed using a key issued to Jimmy, yet Mona confirmed that his key had never left her possession. That left only one explanation: a duplicate key and someone who knew exactly what to look for. Family members, growing more suspicious by the day, attempted to contest the will but were met with legal roadblocks. Every time they filed motions, they were countered by high-powered attorneys who seemed to have unlimited resources. The entire process was dragged out, draining Mona emotionally and financially. One by one, family members gave up, afraid of retaliation, costs, or public humiliation. At the same time, a quiet erasure of Jimmy's legacy was underway. Official Opry archives began shifting his placement in promotional material. Newer documentaries glossed over his role. Tribute nights that once honored him became less frequent. It was as if someone was intentionally trying to fade him into obscurity while controlling the profits behind the scenes. But not everyone stayed quiet. A distant cousin working as a paralegal in Nashville began collecting documents, testimonies, and interview tapes. What she uncovered over the course of a year painted a chilling picture of manipulation, backdoor deals, and an industry willing to sacrifice its legends for financial gain. And now, for the first time, that evidence is being compiled for the public. Because the mystery of what really happened to little Jimmy Dickens isn't just about one man's death. It's about how country music treats its own, when the lights go down, and what happens when the wrong people are allowed to rewrite history. As the pieces finally began to come together, the mystery surrounding little Jimmy Dickens's final years took a turn no one saw coming. The quiet whispers of betrayal, the strange legal maneuverings, the off-limits memorial, all of it now pointed in one chilling direction. For decades, Jimmy had been a symbol of authenticity, a living bridge between country music's humble beginnings and its glittering modern era. But behind the rhinestones and rhinestone suits, a storm had been brewing. And when it finally broke, it exposed something darker than anyone imagined. The truth was hidden in plain sight. A confidential deposition surfaced, recorded months after Jimmy's death, from a former assistant to the entertainment trust that had seized control of his assets. In the deposition, she revealed that Jimmy had expressed fears in his final year, not about death but about being erased, about being used. He allegedly told her, "They want my name, not me. They want my songs, not my story." That chilling confession echoed louder than ever once the estate records were re-examined. Turns out, the Nevada-based trust had quietly sold licensing rights to several of Jimmy's unreleased performances to international buyers without informing the family. His image had been used in promotional materials for a European tour of virtual country legends, and negotiations were underway to turn his likeness into a hologram act, something Jimmy himself had fiercely opposed in life. It didn't end there. A private investigator hired by a family friend traced one of the trust's shell companies to an executive once ousted from a major country label in the early 2000s over financial misconduct. That same executive was quietly serving as a consultant to the team managing Jimmy's catalog, funneling profits through offshore accounts. The level of coordination, deception, and callous disregard was staggering. In the end, it wasn't a murder or a single moment of malice that stained little Jimmy Dickens's legacy. It was exploitation. It was the slow, calculated erasure of a man's control over his life's work, carried out by those who saw him not as a legend, but as leverage. But now the truth is out. Thanks to whistleblowers, family persistence, and a growing outcry from country fans around the world, efforts are underway to restore Jimmy's legacy the right way. A new foundation bearing his name has been proposed, one that will protect the music and memory of forgotten legends. And as this story finally comes to light, one thing is clear. Little Jimmy Dickens may have been small in stature, but his story, now fully told, is towering. And while those who tried to bury the truth may have succeeded for a time, justice at last has caught up.